Hi friends, and welcome to Folklore Diaries. Here, we share real-life horror stories and chilling legends from around the world. Some of them happen to our listeners, others have been passed down for years. So get comfortable but stay alert, because the next story might just keep you awake tonight. And if you like true horror stories, consider subscribing. Okay, let's begin. Hong Kong is a city that never sleeps. Neon lights stretch endlessly, crowds press in on every street, and the hum of life never stops. But sometimes, the most terrifying experiences happen not in the city, but far from it, deep in places the maps forget. This is the story of a cabin that should not exist, and the weekend that changed 5 friends' lives forever. Ming, Yukiko, Aaron, Sophie, and Daniel were exhausted. Hong Kong had worn them down. Jobs, traffic, deadlines, the constant crush of people and noise. They craved silence, nature, a break from the unending chaos. Ming suggested Lantau Island, a forested retreat he had read about. He promised a cabin, hidden deep in the trees, far from roads, far from anyone else. And for a while it felt like escape. The ferry sliced across misty waters, the wind biting their faces. The roads twisted up mountains, narrow paths flanked by bamboo that seemed to whisper with every gust. And then the GPS died. No signal, no route, just forest stretching endlessly, almost alive. And that's when they saw it, a cabin, untouched yet alien, dark wood glistening with dew, windows catching the last rays of sunlight, walls carved with strange symbols that seemed to shift if you glanced sideways. The door stood slightly open, as if inviting them in. Inside, the cabin was ordinary at first glance. 5 beds, a fireplace, a dusty table, but details set their nerves on edge. Scratches along the floor, chairs slightly moved, a smell of damp wood mixed with something metallic, a silence so thick it pressed against their ears. As night fell, subtle things began, creaking floors, the wind brushing against walls, and whispers. Soft, almost imagined at first. "You lied. You're weak." Voices seemed to echo fears they hadn't spoken aloud. Sophie shivered. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Aaron laughed nervously. "It's the wind." But none of them could shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep was impossible, and when they tried to leave, the forest had changed. Landmarks disappeared. Paths twisted. Every direction led back to the cabin. Over the next hours, subtle madness crept in. Ming felt guilt over his past choices, seeing his parents' disappointed faces in shadows. Yukiko imagined children pressing against windows, crying for help. Daniel thought the trees themselves were observing, judging. Aaron, the skeptic, began snapping at everyone, unsure whether what he saw was real. Sophie, sensitive to detail, noticed the carvings seemed different each time she looked. Figures shifted, symbols rearranged. They argued, mistrusted each other. Small accidents grew tense. Scrapes, twisted ankles, faint noises that made them jump. Every step into the forest felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were steering them. Then one by one they disappeared. Not in violent ways, nothing physical, nothing dramatic, but gone. Ming wandered too far and never returned. Aaron became trapped in a loop of trails, circling the cabin until exhaustion took him. Daniel vanished in the shadows of bamboo. By dawn, only Sophie remained, huddled under a bed, shaking, listening as the whispers faded but lingered in her mind. When she finally stumbled onto a path, it led her back to a hiker who helped her return to civilization. Authorities searched the forest, but the cabin was gone. No door, no furniture, no carvings, nothing. Nature had reclaimed the place. Yet Sophie never escaped it. Shadows in her apartment seemed too deep. The faint scent of old wood drifted from nowhere. And sometimes, when the light was just right, she could swear she saw a door that shouldn't exist, slightly ajar, whispering softly. The cabin had fed on fear, not through monsters, but through the mind itself, subtle, patient, and relentless, and perhaps, somewhere, it was waiting for the next visitors. So, if you ever find yourself alone in the quiet forests of Lantau, and a cabin appears where no cabin should remember, some places are forgotten for a reason. And sometimes fear itself is enough to trap you. The cabin in Lantau Island that Sophie and her friends discovered is a classic example of how isolation and unfamiliar environments can heighten fear and warp perception. Located deep within a dense forest, far from marked trails and roads, the area is naturally disorienting. In many forests around Hong Kong, including Lantau, dense bamboo, uneven terrain, and winding paths can make navigation extremely difficult. Trails appear and disappear, and landmarks often look deceptively similar, which can create the sensation of walking in circles, even when moving in a straight line. The cabin itself may have been abandoned for decades, or could have been a temporary shelter for forest workers, hikers, or even squatters. Its intact appearance, carvings, and unusual details likely triggered the friends' subconscious fears. Human brains are highly sensitive to patterns and anomalies. Slight changes in lighting, shadows, or perspective can make stationary objects appear to move, while ambient sounds, wind, rustling leaves, or distant animals, can be misinterpreted as whispers or footsteps. Psychological stress also played a major role. The combination of isolation, darkness, exhaustion, and subtle environmental cues made each friend more vulnerable to fear and paranoia. Conflicts and hallucinations naturally emerged as a result, with each person projecting internal anxieties onto the unfamiliar surroundings. Even the inability to leave the forest felt inescapable, reinforcing the sense that the cabin and forest were alive and actively trapping them. In reality, there was likely no supernatural force at work, just a perfect storm of isolation, environmental confusion, and human psychology. Yet, the fear experienced by Sophie and her friends was entirely real. Their story highlights how ordinary places can become terrifying under the right conditions, and why forests, abandoned buildings, and uncharted paths often give rise to legends. Locals in Lantau Island warn hikers to stick to marked trails, avoid wandering off alone, and respect the forest's silence. The cabin without a name has become a modern cautionary tale, a place that may or may not exist physically, but leaves a lasting impression in the minds of those who encounter it, and a reminder that fear itself can feel as real as any shadow in the woods. Even before Sophie's experience, residents and hikers in Lantau Island's remote forests had shared unsettling stories about the area. Farmers who lived near the higher trails often spoke of hearing footsteps on empty paths at night, soft, deliberate, yet without any visible source. One elder recounted walking back from tending his tea plantation and seeing the silhouette of a small cabin tucked between bamboo thickets, only for it to vanish the moment he blinked or turned a corner. Hikers occasionally report subtle disorientation in that part of the forest. Trails they had walked earlier seemed to shift, and familiar markers like rocks or fallen trees appear in different positions, sometimes leading them in circles. A local guide told a story of a young couple who camped near the area. During the night, they awoke to faint whispers just outside their tent. They described it as neither wind nor animal, just hushed voices, indistinct, almost repeating their own conversations back to them in a distorted way. Terrified, the couple left immediately and never returned to the spot. Another account comes from a delivery worker who occasionally transported supplies to the remote Ngong-Ping monasteries. He claimed to have seen an old, wooden cabin while walking a shortcut through the bamboo forest. The structure looked abandoned, but the air around it felt unnaturally cold. He stepped closer, thinking it might be a rest shelter, but when he returned the next day, there was nothing. No trace of a path or structure, only thick undergrowth where he had stood. Some older villagers insist that the forest itself is alive, in a subtle, imperceptible way. It watches, one said, and it remembers everyone who walks its paths. They warn against wandering alone, especially near dusk, claiming the forest has a way of drawing certain people deeper into it, making the familiar unfamiliar. Interestingly, none of these encounters involve overtly supernatural events. There are no apparitions, no attacks, no creatures. The common thread is disorientation, subtle auditory or visual anomalies, and an overwhelming sense of being watched, all perfectly explainable by the dense forest, shifting light, echoes, and human psychology. but powerful enough to make even experienced hikers uneasy. Even today, locals whisper about the cabin without a name, not as a haunted structure, but as a warning, a place where the forest, isolation, and the human mind intersect to create experiences that feel real and terrifying. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And remember, not every shadow is empty, and not every voice in the dark is in your head. Good night, and stay safe.